In this video, I'm going to go over the endocrine system in the cadaver. Let's go to APR to look at the list. Remember, this is your list of structures you have to be able to identify. In Activity 1, there are 4 structures. Everything under other system structures are things that are on the list just to help you get your orientation. I will not ask you about those on the exam. Let's begin with the hypothalamus. You've got a view here of, this is a sagittal view of the brain. So this is the cerebellum. Remember the corpus callosum, which connects the 2 hemispheres, the midbrain, the pons, and the thalamus. Again, I'm not going to ask you to identify these structures on the quiz. Only the things that are in your system structure list. So let's begin with the hypothalamus. Remember that the hypothalamus is in the diencephalon, and this is the diencephalon here. It is the most inferior part of the diencephalon, and it is going to control either directly or indirectly the activity of the pituitary gland. Recall that the pituitary gland is attached to the hypothalamus by a stalk called the infundibulum, which is right in here. So here's your hypothalamus again. There's the infundibulum, and here is your pituitary gland. Remember, the pituitary gland has 2 lobes, an anterior lobe or adenohypophysis, which consists of glandular tissue, and a posterior lobe or neural hypophysis, which consists of neural tissue. The anterior lobe is going to release 6 hormones. The posterior lobe will release 2 hormones. The hormones released by the posterior pituitary are synthesized in the hypothalamus, whereas the hormones released by the anterior pituitary are synthesized by the anterior pituitary. Lastly, the pineal gland. The pineal gland is located in the 3rd ventricle, which, remember, the 3rd ventricle is going to be in this area here, and it is in the epithalamus, which is here. So there's the pineal gland. It is going to release melatonin. Let's go to Activity 2. In Activity 2, we're going to look at the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is going to be at the base of the throat. So we're looking at the cadaver throat here. And right there it is. It will have 2 lobes. Now we're going to look at the pancreas. This is your belly button. Here is your pancreas. The pancreas is shaped like a tadpole. It will release 2 hormones that we're going to study: insulin, released by the beta cells, and glucagon, released by the alpha cells of the pancreatic islets. It is shaped like a tadpole, and it will have a head. Surrounding the head is the duodenum. Again, you will not be responsible for identifying the duodenum in this endocrine quiz. This is the body of the pancreas, and then we will have the tail of the pancreas. On to Activity 4. What you're looking at here is your kidney. And sitting atop the kidney is an adrenal gland or suprarenal gland. Suprarenal because it is above the renal gland. These are paired since you have 2 kidneys. The suprarenal gland will be divided into adrenal medulla and an adrenal cortex, as you recall from lecture. The cortex is going to have 3 zona: an outer zona glomerulosa that releases aldosterone, a mineralocorticoid, a middle zona fasciculata, which releases cortisol, a glucocorticoid, and an inner zona reticularis, which releases sex hormones, primarily androgens. The zona reticularis is adjacent to the adrenal medulla, which is in the center. And remember, the adrenal medulla releases catecholamines, which consist of norepinephrine and epinephrine. Don't forget, you can go over here to the icon here, and that will give you some additional information about that particular structure. Let's go back to the list, and we'll move on to the next activity. In activity 5, we are looking at the pituitary gland. This is a histology slide of the pituitary gland. It will have 2 lobes. Each lobe functions as a separate gland. The anterior pituitary, and notice the anterior pituitary is going to stain darker. So that's the anterior pituitary or adenohypophysis, releasing 6 hormones. Remember, if we go over here to the eye, it's going to tell us what hormones are released, and they're listed right in here. And you should know these from lecture. And then the posterior pituitary. Oh, one last thing about the anterior pituitary. Remember for lecture that the release of the anterior pituitary hormones are regulated by releasing and inhibiting tropic hormones from the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary, which is neural tissue, is also the neural hypophysis. And remember, it releases oxytocin and ADH, antidiuretic hormone. These hormones are synthesized in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary. Let's move on to activity 6. This is another histology slide of the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is going to consist of these circular structures here, which are called thyroid follicles. So these are looking at the thyroid follicles. They include these follicular cells here. Let me take off the highlight, and you can see these are the nuclei of all of the follicular cells. They make up the walls of the follicle. So think of a hollow ball. And inside the follicle, you will have a substance called colloid. So all of this highlights the inside of each follicle. Here are follicular cells in this follicle, making up the walls of the follicle. Here is the colloid. It's going to consist of thyroglobulin made from tyrosine and iodine. The cells, and they release thyroid hormone, the follicular cells do. And remember, you have 2 types of thyroid hormone, T3, triiodothyronine, and T4, thyroxine. In between the thyroid follicles are cells called parafollicular cells, and the parafollicular cells release calcitonin, involved in decreasing blood calcium levels. So this is a follicle right here. These are the follicular cells making up the walls of the follicle. And then these are the parafollicular cells located between the follicles. Now let's look at a histology slide of the adrenal gland. So if you're looking at this right in here in the center, this lighter staining area in the center is the adrenal medulla. Starting with this darker region and going outward, this is going to be the adrenal cortex. So here is the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. Remember that the adrenal cortex is going to consist of 3 zones. We're going to start with the outermost zone, which is the glomerulus. It is right underneath the capsule. Here's the capsule. The middle zone is the fasciculata. It will be the largest zone, and then adjacent to, remember this is the adrenal medulla, so adjacent to the adrenal medulla is the innermost zone. This is the zona reticularis. So zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. Again, go to the eye icon to see what hormones are released by each one. So you need to know the hormones that are released by each zona as well as their class. Remember, for glomerulosa, it is going to be, these are going to be mineralocorticoids, and the example would be aldosterone as the hormone. For zona fasciculata, these are going to be glucocorticoids, that would be the class, and the hormone would be cortisol. And then for the reticularis, that would be the gonatocorticoids, and the example would be androgens or sex hormones. Remember that all of the hormones released by the adrenal cortex are going to be steroid hormones. Now let me take off the highlight. And here you can see right in here, right underneath, deep 2, here's your capsule, will be the zona glomerulosa. And then this layer here is stained slightly differently. This is the zona fasciculata. And then when you get into the area that stains a little bit darker and it's adjacent to what I think is kind of like a blue staining area, that is going to be the zona reticularis. This is looking at the pancreas. This is a pancreatic islet or endocrine portion of the pancreas. The islets release insulin by beta cells and glucagon by the alpha cells. The darker purple structures, these are the acini, and they produce digestive enzymes and buffers, and they are exocrine glands. They're going to release their substances into a duct. You can see a duct here, and that's going to empty into the first part of the small intestine called the duodenum. So here is the exocrine portion, and here are the pancreatic islets. You can just call them pancreatic islets, or you can call them pancreatic islets or islets of Langerhans. That is an older term. We just simply call them pancreatic islets. Click on the eye so you can see what hormones are released by the pancreatic islets. Now we're looking at another histology slide of the adrenal gland or suprarenal gland. This is going to be the capsule here, so we're moving from the capsule inward. This area here, you can see it's stained slightly differently. This is going to be the adrenal medulla, which releases those catecholamines, epinephrine primarily, and norepinephrine. Now, from here, you can see right in here, all the way up to here, you are going to have the adrenal cortex. Do you see the purple staining area here right underneath the capsule? This is going to be the zona glomerulosa. You get into this lighter staining area. This is going to be the zona fasciculata. And now you get into this darker staining area. That will be the zona reticularis, immediately adjacent to the adrenal medulla. So let's do the highlights. Here is the cortex. Remember, this is going to be the capsule. Here is the medulla. For the cortex, we have the zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. Again, those colors are very subtle, but you do see some differences in the staining. And that concludes this activity. So not a lot to learn this time for the endocrine quiz, but be sure that you can identify all of these structures. In addition, for each of the glands, you need to know what hormones they release. You do not need to know their targets or actions. That was covered in lecture. So you need to know what hormones are released by each gland. And when we're talking about the anterior and posterior pituitary lobes, you need to know what hormones are released by each lobe and where are they synthesized. Remember, for the posterior pituitary, they are synthesized in the hypothalamus and released by the posterior pituitary. For the anterior pituitary, they are synthesized and released by the anterior pituitary. And then for the adrenal gland or suprarenal gland, be sure you know the zonas, the classes of hormones released by each zona, and an example of a hormone for each class. And then the adrenal medulla, the class would be the catecholamines, and the hormones there would be epinephrine primarily, about 80%, and norepinephrine for the remaining 20%. So this concludes this video.